All right, hey everyone. I'm Liberty Dude. My friends call me Liberty Dude. Um, yeah, I'm surprised someone still remembers that, but oh yeah, no, that was a thing. Believe me. But my name is Liberty Dude. I know I just said that, but I'm a stickler for repetition. Uh, This is the MLP Books and Comics Canon or Fanon panel. If you thought it was anything else, you can leave now. But if you're here, thank you. And we're going to start. So you're probably wondering what's this panel about, because the thing in the book was kind of brief. But the basic idea is that this panel is going to be discussing the canonicity of the MLP book series and comic book series. The comic book series done by IDW, the books done by GM Berrow. In case you didn't know what that means, canon basically means a thing that officially happened within the MLP universe. There's no doubt about it, it happened. And fanon basically means it's what fans think happened or just sort of say, oh, that might have been cool to have, sort of like a headcanon, but it's basically not proven. It's just a fun little thing fans like to say existed. Now, I'm assuming if you came to this panel, you probably know what the books and comics are, but I wrote this just in case some casuals came in, so I want to give a brief little thing about it. The comic was started way back in 2012. Some of you may remember that year. It's done by Katie Cook and Andy Price initially, and a bunch of other artists have come on. It's been going since 2012, and it's about My Little Pony. There's really no elaboration, needed. But along with that, we've had a few other comic series. We initially had Ponytails, or some people called it the Micro series, which is basically just individual adventures each of the ponies had. But that was replaced by Friends Forever, which is basically a team-up. Sometimes between main characters, sometimes between background supporting characters. But it's always a team-up, and I think it's usually pretty fun. And the other one is Fiendship is Magic, which was a mini-series that did an issue each on some of the villains of MLP. Most of those I think were pretty good, but so those are the comics. The chapter books we're talking about, well, they're what they sound like. They're chapter books. They were written by GM Berrow. Most of you have probably heard of her. And like the original micro series, it focuses on individual adventures. And it's not just the main six. I've seen one for Discord, Lyra and Bonbon, all the princesses. Yeah, so it stretches beyond the main six, but I'll mostly be referencing the main six ones. So canon or fanon? This actually is surprisingly a big amount of debate among the bronies. The bronies, yes, not us, it's the bronies. But it is surprisingly something people get pretty heated about. Whenever I go online saying, well, you know, I kind of like this about the comic, you know, other people will say, oh, no, that shouldn't have happened in the comic. It's horrible. Give me Bleach. And it really does perk people up a bit. But one of the things I want to do with this panel is I wanted to examine the arguments done by both sides, because I think both sides have a relevant point. I personally do kind of lean towards one side, but I think both sides have an interesting point that I think we should examine at least. Before we get to these arguments, I want to lay a few ground rules. I'm not going to be referencing anything from the annuals, the holiday specials, or the Daring Do books, for the simple fact that I haven't read some of them, so I don't want to reference anything that I've never read and look stupid while doing that. No Equestria Girls either, because if you think people get heated over the comics and books, wait until you say Equestria Girls is canon. They really go nuts for that. And the second thing I'm going to want to emphasize, it's an all or nothing argument. Either all of it is canon or none of it is canon, because if you could just pick and choose, this would be real easy. There's stories a lot of people agree are really good and would like to take from there, and others that they think are kind of bad and don't want. Too easy. So we're going to stick with an all or nothing sort of deal. So we're first going to talk about the Fanon. Got to start off negative. Diamond Tiara doesn't like it, apparently. And apparently neither does God. But yeah, God hates things being revised. That's why there's no such thing as the New Testament. So get with it. So the first argument I'm going to examine, it's 6 arguments each, in case I forgot to mention that, is that there's no involvement really of any of the TV show crew. Now this is for the comics specifically, because I know for a fact G.M. Berrow has written an episode for the main series. So she didn't when I originally made this, but she does now, so this doesn't apply to the books. But a lot of the problems you could argue that happen in the comics could be drawn from this non-involvement of the TV show crew, because to put it simply, what the comic writers think the characters might be doing, the TV show writers might not, or vice versa. And the problem is, when you get all these differing views from different writers, you can sometimes get a different idea of what a character should be. Like I was up at the comic creator panel earlier today. You know, Andy Price was saying how much he hated Rainbow Dash. But you know, like Jeremy Whiteley is what? The Jerster. He was talking about how much he liked Rainbow Dash. So we have this conflicting ideas that sort of may affect how the writers make the characters, and in turn affect how we look at them. The editor, actually, of IDW, Bobby Curnow, all these names, I can't pronounce names. He basically went along the lines of that while the comics do their best to follow the show, the TV show writers are not obligated to follow it either. So, yeah, there's sort of a big disconnect between the TV show and the comic series, at least in terms of creatives, at least in terms of the creative side. Move on to another one. This is a particularly big one, the plot inconsistencies. Now, the problem is, if you know anything about the comics and books, you'll know that there are some points where they kind of deviate from what is generally accepted to be show canon. For instance, comics, there's this really big dragon community in Philadelphia that this particular issue takes place in, but this really goes against what was established in Dragon Quest. Which basically said that they didn't know that much about dragons because they were too scary or too vicious or whatnot. And the problem with that is pretty plain. If you had an entire neighborhood filled with these people living amongst you, you'd probably know a little more about them than just, you know, sometimes they glow and have to migrate. That doesn't make sense. I mean, we got a lot of different neighborhoods around here in Baltimore, and we're not completely mysterious about their ways, as it were. So yeah, that doesn't make a lot of sense. And another one would be the Nightmare Rarity thing. Because Nightmare Rarity arc, you may remember, was that the Nightmare forces basically took over Rarity, and she became another Nightmare. The problem is, they act as if the Nightmare is a separate entity from Luna, and that's obviously something that really goes against the show because, well, Luna was Nightmare Moon, and they very specifically say that it was her own personal faults that caused her to turn into Nightmare Moon and the like of that. So, yeah, there is sort of a conflicting plot. Some would argue that it's like it's sort of a different interpretation. I don't know. I personally kind of think it's treading that line a little too closely. And the books themselves are no stranger to this either. Crystal Heart Spell, one of the antagonists is Trixie, who, if you don't know the story, basically goads Twilight into being like this hateful, emotionally angry pony. But the problem is, Magic Duel, when Trixie appears, they act as if this is the first time they've met. And the problem is the Crystal Heart Spell can't be happening after Magic Duel, because Trixie is clearly a bad guy in the Crystal Heart Spell, not just like a little bit of a jerk. So, again, it doesn't really make sense. The Crystal Heart Spell, by all accounts of means, is taking place in a weird sort of at times, it technically couldn't have happened based on the way they've been interacting. So, yeah, that can be a problem. This next one is OOC movements. OOC stands for out of character. I don't know about you guys, but if this is the strongest argument for me, because one of the big reasons I got into the show was the characters. I really enjoyed the characters, how they interacted and things like that. And when they don't act like like it feels how they should act, it doesn't work for me. It's really noticeable. And the problem is the comics and books do have examples of this. One notorious example is The Good, the Bad, and the Ponies, where Twilight was saying, oh, I can't use my magic against these cattle rustler guys because legal reasons? I don't know. It was kind of shaky. But it's kind of went against the idea because she's been using magic against people all the time. And also, if you know anything about Twilight, these cattle rustlers were basically beating up her own friends. And she still said, oh, no, I can't touch them because, they're legal citizens of Equestria. Yeah, that doesn't sound like the Twilight most of us know. Most of us know would probably go, no, you're not doing that. Zap. And it'd be over. But I guess plot armor? I'm not sure why, but it was a really noticeable trend. A lot of people didn't really like that series. And this was the one sort of internally, in the Fiendship is Magic 3, one of the things that goes on is Star Swirl goes against the Dazzlings, but he never really has much of a reason to. I mean, the Dazzlings are just kind of singing, but they're not really doing anything malevolent, at least within the terms of the story. And Star Swirl kind of comes up as sort of this jerk who just got mad because they were stealing his spotlight or something. And again, I know that the Dazzlings were called a good menace in Rainbow Rocks, but it's not really emphasized in the comic all that well. And this really does conflict with, I know he's not been in the show, but Star Swirl actually has been in the comics. You may remember the Reflections arc. And it really doesn't co-align with that aspect of his personality either. And the books themselves suffer from this because before she was reformed, Gilda actually appears in the Crystal Heart spell as a toady to Trixie. And if we know Gilda, she probably wouldn't be so eager to follow someone else. She really comes off as sort of this hot-headed person that would just do whatever she wants, at least before she was reformed, and not go with the flow. So that kind of felt a little noticeable, too, to me. Number 3, this one's pretty simple. It will overcomplicate the franchise. What's pictured there are the Star Wars and Star Trek novels that have all been printed. There's actually more of them, but that was the most collected one I could find. Yeah, and this is sort of a problem because if somebody doesn't read the comics or read the books or anything like that, they might be pretty confused if the show suddenly starts referencing these events and saying, yeah, this happened. Yeah, wacky adventures and the like, you know. Yeah, anybody that's not read them will be, what just happened? I mean, an overcomplication, by that I mean, a lot of things have happened in the books and comics. It's not that, I've read a good chunk of them, even I can hardly keep it together. It's just overcomplicated, you know. They could always go to Disney route and just, you know, ban all the expanded universe of Star Wars. Of course, some people may still get mad about that, so, yeah. This is another one that was often brought up in my research. There's sort of an extreme variance in quality with the books and comics. Some people would argue that that's present in the show too, but I will admit it is kind of more noticeable within the comics and books. I don't think it's as big of a problem with the books, because the ones I looked at here, Rainbow Dash story was personally one of my favorites of the books. AJ wasn't. But it's not as big a problem because A, it's G.M. Berrow and it's at one writer, so you've pretty much got a consistent quality for the most part. but it's really noticeable with the comics. We had the Return of Queen Chrysalis versus the Good, the Bad, and the Ponies, done by the exact same team of Andy Price and Katie Cook. Vastly different outcomes. And that we have one of the best comic series and one of the worst, honestly. And it's this variance of quality that can sort of turn people away from the idea of canonizing it because, yeah, we might get this good Chrysalis story, but then we'll have this other story with this really bad case of out of characterness from Twilight, and do we really want to acknowledge that? I mean, it's something to think about. And the number one reason is that there's just so many big events within the show. What I've got listed here is basically all the major things that have happened within the comics and the books themselves. Things that a show would probably have a field day dealing with, but might look somewhat redone if the books have already done it. Yeah, and the whole problem is that this can sort of make the implications of the stories and books feel a little lessened, because I have like the Reflections arc there. A lot of big things happen in the Reflections arc. We see like Celeste used to be in love, there's alternate universes now, other things like that. Huge implications, but again, maybe not referenced in the in-canon show universe. The problem is this can lead rise to something I like to call Twilight's brother syndrome. This is basically, some of you may not remember, but back in season 2, there was sort of a lot of fan, not outcry per se, but sort of ness when it was revealed that Twilight had a brother, and they went by the old, oh, he was there, we just never mentioned him. A lot of people felt that was kind of cheap, I guess might be the best word. And the problem is that might happen with these books if you canonize them. You're taking all these big events, saying, yeah, they happened, but not really showing them, and just saying, oh yeah, they totally happened, guys. You mean, yeah, don't question it, get out of my face. But that can, yeah, like I said, it can feel a little cheap if you say all these things totally happened, but they also didn't happen? I mean, it's a weird thing. Basically, the argument says that these should be focuses within the show, not in the media, simply because they're so big and so important that by just sort of shoehorning them in with the comics and books, you're sort of saying, this wasn't that big of a deal, even though it kind of was. So that's sort of problematic. But now we're going to move on to the canon arguments, which basically are the arguments, well, what they sound like. They're the ones that push this idea that the books and comics should be canon. Excuse me. Well, number 6 is probably one that's pretty relevant. Hasbro actually does regulate the stories. Despite what we like to think, Hasbro actually does monitor these stories pretty closely. Up at the Comic Creators panel, Andy Price actually mentioned that there were several events that were actually changed within the comics due to things that were happening within the show. The example I've got here was actually from the very first issue. Apparently, they wanted to do a comic about the Cutie Mark Crusaders camping, but around this time, Sleepless in Ponyville was going to be shown that season, so Hasbro didn't want that being done in the comic book form either. So they changed it to the Return of Queen Chrysalis instead of a camping thing, and I think it turned out pretty well, so that's fun. And Hasbro also made it so that certain characters couldn't be used, because when they were starting the series up, Discord was still trapped after the events of the season 2 premiere, and excuse me. And Hasbro basically said, no, you can't use Discord. Well, because A, they were bringing them back the 3rd season, and B, they didn't want it to make it too extraordinary. I mean, obviously the re-imprisoning of Discord was a big event. They didn't want something that flat out went against it by taking place at roughly the same time, but at the same time sort of going against what the show was saying. So these stories are regulated. Hasbro doesn't just say, fine, whatever. They do read these things. They do make sure that they're up to date, as the best word I can think of. Number 5, the show itself has actually had a few issues with Canon itself. If you can look at these two pictures, do you notice one major difference? Do you? That's right. Maud is not there. A lot of people would say this. I'm not sure you could quite call it a retcon, because you could say, well, maybe she was just like out late to get to the party first. She just came in later. But yeah, that is technically not a pure canon thing. They sort of changed it around a bit. But a lot of people like Maud, so nobody's really complaining about that. And right from the very first episode, we have this sort of canonity problem, because Luna looks significantly different from the first time we see her. And the thing is, I tried to find why she looked different. And there's a lot of theories about why her appearance changed, but I couldn't really find a solid one that said, yeah, this is the reason. It's mostly a fan theory that basically goes, well, as her magic came back, she looked more like she used to. Which, okay, but again, not really explained in depth in the show, so it sort of leaves itself as a questionable change. And one of the things you got to remember is that there is a very variable time scale with these things. Not everything happens exactly in order. And we know this because Season 2, Episode 7, that was the one where Rainbow Dash finally got Tank. However, 4 episodes later was the Hearthswarming Eve episode, which was during the winter. And if any of you remember Season 5, you know what Tank had to do in the winter. But the thing is, if that was the first time Dash was doing it with him, discovering he was doing that, how could this Episode 7 and Episode 11 happened directly after each other? It doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. So from that perspective, you can sort of see that the comics and books just sort of go along with that variable time scale. They could have happened now, later, some other time. You could maybe make them fit. So that's one thing. This one's a purely selfish one. I'm a big Luna fan, and I really think the comics and books have done a lot for her. One reason is that I think her personality is a bit more interesting in the comics. One of the biggest problems I had with the show is that the show, from like Season 3 to Season 5, really kind of pigeonholed Luna in this role as like the Cutie Mark Crusader teacher, which wasn't bad. I mean, I liked those episodes, but that seemed to be the most we often saw of her in those seasons. We didn't really see the goofier Luna in like Luna Eclipsed, or the more saddened Luna in like the Tantibus episode. It just didn't feel right. Meanwhile, in the comics, we've got stories where like she takes on Celestia's day duties. That was actually pretty funny. We got one where she was a big influence in the Nightmare Rarity arc, and actually that one tackled Luna's guilt before the Tantibus one. So keep that in mind. There's actually there's also the Spike in Luna with one. One I haven't read was the Discord in Luna one. I really want to read that one. I just bought it, but yeah, she does more things, and you see more sides to her personality in the comics, and that's something I think that's sorely been missing. A lot of people complain about Celestia not getting an episode in the TV show. I kind of think Luna has been getting them, but not necessarily the right ones. So we also need to consider the almighty power of Tiberius. Tiberius needs to be in the show. That's just the fact of life. He's an awesome possum. That's what I can say. Number 3, this to me is, if I had to argue for why the shows should be canon, this to me is the biggest reason. Because character, like I said before, was the reason I really got into the show. And discovering more character is actually a big part of it too. And one of the problems I think the show has sort of fallen into, intentionally or not, is that it always seems to focus on either the main 6, Spike, or the Cutie Mark Crusaders, except for Slice of Life, but that was the special episode. And this sort of raises the problem for me because, yeah, the show does have to follow a formula to a point, but when you always focus on the same characters, there's all these others that have such huge potential, and you're not really examining them all that much. And part of that could be the formula, just the television way. You can't focus on everything all the time. But, if you canonize the comics, you might be able to do that, work in the characters a bit more. And when I say character focus, what do I mean? One is that characters that haven't met each other on the show, because that can actually be really interesting. Mysteries in Manhattan was actually one of my favorite story arcs, simply because, well, for one, I'm just going to say this as a general rule. A general rule for the comics is that if it has Discord or Trixie in it, it's usually gold. I've never read a Trixie story I didn't like in the comics. And teaming her up with Babs Seed in that episode was... comic was actually pretty fun. I enjoyed that. The CMC and Discord are gold too. They met twice. Both of them are great. I love those ones. Spike and Luna was kind of meh, but at least it happened. So, and we also got, and in the stories, we got Pinky's family in the main 6. I know we saw Pinky's family recently in that one episode, but I don't know. That was just sort of with the Apple family. That wasn't really with the rest of the main 6. And I think the Pinky story sort of did that a little more interestingly. On Fluttershy, I actually met Flim and Flam in her story, which was kind of interesting. It's a weird thing. That Fluttershy story actually felt kind of more like an Angel story throughout it. But yeah, at least she met Flim and Flam, who, as we all know, will take over the world with industry, if you saw the season 5 finale. There's also a wider range of relationships with these characters. One of my favorites of the Friends Forever was the Iron Will episode, comic, because the Iron Will comic really makes an examination of his family life without even showing his family, but I think it's effective, and it sort of shows the idea, people might not have the best family life. It's interesting. Then we got like Celestia and Sombra and their Reflections arc, Angel and Fluttershy, the Rarity story. Yeah, that one was pretty good. It's sort of showing Rarity in a master role with her apprentice, who was called Charity, in case you couldn't tell. Yeah, it sort of shows a wider range of relationships that I don't think the show has always tackled, at least not to this extent. Yeah, and the background characters. The background characters, I think, have been getting a lot of good exposure in the comics. I mean, Big Mac was in the main series, no less, not in like the Friends Forever micro-series, but in the main series way back when, given his own 2 issues to do his thing. And it was a grand time for me. Then we got folks like Spitfire. I'm trying to remember. There was another one that was fairly recent. Whatever. But we get bottom line. The background characters have been getting a lot of exposure in the comics. Actually, as well in the books. I'm not sure you could call Discord a background or supporting character, but but he did get his own story, and it showed an interesting side to him. The sort of, not just the wacky, chaotic side, but sort of the more accepting side, the one that sort of wants to actually be liked by the ponies. And like the Fluttershy story, as I've said, sort of showed Angel's personal determination. Although frankly, I think it was more stubbornness on Angel's part, but it's still an interesting thing to see, and these are sort of things that we haven't seen in the show, at least not to this extent and not as focused on, and it's a shame because I think a lot of these are pretty interesting and would contribute to a lot of good stories in the main series. Number 2, it adds an edge to the show. When I say edge, I mean sort of the Don Bluth edge, if you know what I'm talking about. If you know Don Bluth's work, he sort of does darker fantasy work, not inappropriate for kids, but dark enough to the point you notice it apart from Disney. One of the things is that this isn't really anything new compared to the show, at least in terms of tone. The show has gone to dark places before. I mean, if you remember the end of the part 1 of season 2 finale, for all intents and purposes, it shows Twilight getting dragged to the Never Realm. Intense, you know. Season 5, I mean, I'm kind of surprised they went there in that show. I mean, it's a happy ending, yeah, but that was some weird stuff, man. And when I say dark, some examples are people, when they get punished in the comic series, they get really punished in the comic series. Back with the Everfree Forest arc, the main bad guy in the end gets straight up eaten by I forget what it's called, the Hydra, I believe. Yeah, I mean, they don't show it, but it's still kind of, oh, you really did that. And there's also the Reflections arc. That's sort of a controversial arc. For just as many people that like it, there's a fair number of people that really don't, believe it or not. But, you know, the ending is like bittersweet. I mean, you save the dimensions, but you don't get the handsome good guy Greg Sombra. So, yeah, it's not a purely happy ending. And that's something I sort of liked in the comic book series. Sometimes a little darkness goes a long way. And frankly, all of Fiendship is Magic can be considered a real downer. I mean, the Sombra story, that's a depressing one, I'm going to be honest. Yeah, the Chrysalis story is not much better, but all this darkness, but the problem is the darkness within those comics at least helped explain why the villains were the way they were. It actually helped the universe, most people would agree, at least in establishing these characters and their motives. And it's not a bad reason to keep them canon with the show. This is the number 1 argument you could make for it being canon. Just all in all, more experimentation. Now, when I say experimentation, I mean thematically. Not necessarily artistically, though there is plenty of that, but mostly just in the way that the stories are told. Because one of the problems, like I was saying earlier, is that the show kind of has gotten stuck in its own little formula. But this is a formula the comics don't necessarily have to follow because A, it's a little easier to make the comics, so you don't have to be as stuck on a formula like the TV show is. Yeah, and it just allows more interesting ideas to be approached, at least, and to be approached in different ways. And when I say different ways, I basically mean things like the issue number 23. That is a comic almost completely without dialogue. It's just from the perspectives of the pets. There's no dialogue until the very end. That's not really something I've seen a lot from the show. There's even that story, the Diamond Tiara and Silver Spoon team up in Friends Forever, where the story was told from their own perspective, and was sort of supposed to be like the Cutie Mark Crusaders are the bad guys, even though they're clearly not, but Diamond Tiara's huge ego is just so blinding. She makes it sound as if she's the victim throughout the entire comic. And it's an interesting idea. And also with the comics, there's a lot more genre play. The Reflections arc sort of took that alternate dimension thing hinted at in Equestria Girls, and sort of played with that and took it to a different level. Ooh, excuse me. And it sort of took a sort of sci-fi era, like sci-fi tends to deal more with alternate dimensions these days than a lot of fantasy stories do. But it was still interesting to do that within MLP. Night of the Apples, I actually read that recently, and it's actually one of my favorite because I'm just kind of a fan of sci-fi B-movies from like the 50s, and this is a very B-movie feel tone to it. And it's just interesting to see, and yeah, I like it, so there's that. And the books also sort of do this thing with genre. The Rainbow Dash story, like I said, is my favorite of the books, and that one sort of starts off as sort of this weird, you think it's going to be sort of the slice of life tale where Dash keeps doing all these dares, and you think, okay, she's eventually going to fail and learn a lesson about, you know, don't push yourself, don't be a braggart, things like that. But then, like, halfway through the book, it suddenly switches gears and turns into this weird sort of adventure tale, almost like a daring do story, you could say. And it just sort of goes from there, and it's very strange, but it works within the terms of the story. And genre shifting is very hard to pull off, because if you start off a story one way, people usually tend to prefer it if you stick to that particular genre. But when you do it right, it can really work. And I thought that story did it really good. And there's genre mixing. The Lyron Bonbon story, I actually haven't gotten to that yet, but it sort of takes the idea of a secret agency and puts it in this weird fantasy environment. And again, it's kind of weird. You wouldn't really see this from a usual fantasy story, but it's an interesting idea at the very least. And yeah, it's just fun, you know? And I want to emphasize that I know one thing I do appreciate about the show now, post season 3, is that I do think the show has been getting a little more experimental as time's gone on, because season 5 we've actually had the Inspector Rarity, I think that was it, or Detective Rarity, where, you know, it keeps zooming in and out of sort of a noirish feel. I like noirs, and that was fun. I thought it fit within the show, but it was still kind of doing something different, and that's great. And just recently, we had season 6, the Saddle Row review, which was doing something that really hasn't been done all that much on the show, constantly hopping back and forth between past, present, sort of, and using that to sort of tell the jokes, jumping back. I don't know what clothes are, you know, things like that. So the show has been getting more experimental, but the comics seem to have been doing this more experimental feel for a little bit longer. And some may argue been doing it maybe a little bit more and maybe even a little bit better. But I wouldn't go that far. They've at least been doing it, and that's what counts. So where does that leave us in the end? Because we've heard a lot of arguments, and there's definitely something to be said for a few of them. Well, the problem is I decided to look up what Jim Miller said. Jim Miller is actually one of the directors for MLP. I'm not sure if he's considered that still or if that's moved on to someone else, but at the time I was making this, he was. And basically, he said officially the comics and shows would remain separate. So that would seem to clear cut it, but the thing is, the show and comics are sort of in a state of flux because they're approved by Hasbro. They go through all the stuff. Hasbro has to approve of it. And it's not something that's done willy-nilly. But it's not officially sort of recognized by the show itself. And it's sort of, this sort of was a thing Big Jim said. He basically said everything's canon until it's not, nothing is canon until it is. Yeah, he really clears that up for us, doesn't he? But But yeah, it's this weird state of flux that we really can't say whether it's fully canon or fully not. And that can be sort of a problem. And really, in the end, the only thing that'll make this tie official is if some sort of reference happens within the TV show that directly collaborates the stuff that goes in the comics and thus makes them A-OK, or it says something completely different and says, no, didn't happen, this is the way it happened. That's really, in the end, the only way this can be settled. But I guess until the end, it should just be up to you. If you really like the comics, great. Just come back this way, break the cup. Well, if you really like the comics, you can say it's canon. You really hate them, you should probably stop reading them, but you can just ignore them. Actually, Big Jim sort of put it as, he just doesn't want to argue about it. He's just glad that we have more pony either way. And yeah, I kind of agree with that assumption. You know, the comics have ups, downs, as do the books, but I think in the end, when they're good, they're good. And yeah, I don't think we should totally ignore them. Maybe not make them officially canon, but I think they're at least worth glancing at and at least worth discussing about. And yeah, that's basically it. I came out of a college course about designing PowerPoint, so this is just a leftover from that. So now we've got a bit of time left, more time than I thought we'd have, to do a little, maybe not Q&A, but a little discussion if anybody has anything they want to say about the issue or anything like that. Given how small it is, you might not even have to go. Should they go to the microphone regardless?
It's okay. They're fine where they are. Whatever, it's dealer's choice. Whatever they want to do.
Okay, so if any of you have anything to say, just raise your hand and I'll just point at you. Yeah?
What are your thoughts on Amy Keating Rogers' book of the Journal of the Two Sisters? There's a lot of debate on whether to accept that book as canon to the series as well.
Okay. I'm not sure if the camera picked it up, so I'm just going to say it for the record. He basically asked if the Amy Keating Rogers book, The Journal of the Two Sisters, should be considered canon. I hate to say this, but I'm actually not the one qualified to say that because I actually haven't read it. So, yeah, so I hate to give a quick answer. That's I don't know. Anybody else? We won't laugh at you. Come on. Well, since we have a little time, I'll just ask, does anyone have a particularly favorite comic series, ones that you think probably, if you could, would like to make canon? The Rarity Micro? Okay. Oh, the one with the hippies, right? Yeah, that was a fun one. Again, comics did the hippies before, what's-her-face, Tree Hugger came around. Yep, that's it. Wheatgrass Flaxseed. Does anyone else have a particularly favorite one? Oh, that's Somber Fiendship. That is a very good one. I'm going to be honest, the entire Fiendship is Magic series is actually one of my favorite miniseries, simply because I think most of the stories are pretty solid. I think 3 of them are grand. One of them I think is just kind of okay. Only one of them I think is kind of not good. So, and I'm pretty sure most of you probably know the one that I think is not that good. Do you? It was the Dazzlings one, just in case you were curious. But, all right, is there any other favorites, perhaps? You? Got any favorites?
Well, one I do remember reading is the Applejack and Mayor one with the tax thing. That was pretty funny.
Oh, yeah, the Applejack and Mayor, the tax thing. Yeah, that actually was better than I thought it'd be. I know it's a slice of life tale. I kind of prefer adventure tales just because I'm sort of one of those guys that goes, you got a great fantasy setting, might as well use it. But yeah, that one I actually enjoyed because it wasn't as dull as I thought it'd be because I actually have worked for a legal authority before. It's a very droning job. I mean, I was just a paralegal for an intern for a while. It's a very dull job. If you like excitement, don't get into any legal field. It's not like Law and Order or any of those other shows show you it to be. It's a lot of paperwork and it's very dull. Does anyone else have any favorites or you?
Actually, probably gonna seem like a casual right now. I have only dabbled into a few of the comics, just the really big ones.
Oh.
So I was really wondering, is there a site that just lists everything by release order? Because I was trying to look around Wikipedia.
Yeah, well, yeah. I'm gonna be honest. I often look at Wikipedia too, but I'm pretty sure. I thought for a while there was some sort of Equestria Daily thing for it. I don't know if they took that down or something. There should be some comic book subscription services that will help you out with that. I can't name them because I don't use them, but yeah, you should probably look around for just some subscription sites and you'll be fine. Yeah, yes, actually, he makes a great point. MLP Wiki's pretty good. Oh yeah, yeah. I'm actually glad you brought that up. The MLP Wiki was a lifesaver. I got a lot of the photos for this from that. I actually think it's just as I go to that more than I go to the actual Wikipedia, but. I presume you sitting next to him are kind of more casual. Oh, you're really new.
He's casual, I'm like.
Shh.
How did you finish season 6?
What? Did you start from the beginning or did you just start from the new? Oh. Yeah, I started the same way. Way back in 2011, I started episode 1, just went from there. I don't know. I mean, it doesn't make a lot of sense now given how variable the time scale is with these things, but I still like watching it in order. It doesn't feel right if you don't watch it in order. At least for me. I'm an order freak. So we talked about favorites. Does anyone have comics that they don't particularly like? We won't judge you if you say you don't like them.
One that I don't care for, the one that I see that is usually listed constantly as one of the least favorite is the Rainbow Dash Micro.
The Rainbow Dash Micro? Yeah, I can see that. I'm not sure I really hate that one, but I do think it's one of the weaker of the micros. There's really only one moment that I can say I really dislike, and it's a small scene, but there's that scene where the Cloud Gremlins, I think they're called, basically do this entire ripoff of the Tears in the Rain speech from Blade Runner. And it's just really awkward. Like, they're trying desperately to make this sound like, oh, this is a cool thing the villain says, but if you actually know Blade Runner and have seen that movie, you know that doesn't fit the situation at all. I mean, in Blade Runner, he was saying that because he was dying, which is not happening in the comic book series. And I will say, that's one thing a lot of people have pointed out is that they have a problem with in the comic series. The pop culture references. A lot of people have argued that they're more in your face in the comics and books than they are in a TV show. Personally, I think it's just because a lot of us here are really into pop culture, so we just notice them far easier than other people would. But yeah, I can sort of see the problem with that. When you try to put too much pop culture into it, because the thing is, with an episode, you have to rewatch the episode to go and catch things that you might have missed. With a book and a comic, you can just stop right there and go back to it anytime you want and go, well, I hate this, and just leave. So yeah, that is a problem. Does anyone else have any questionable comics they don't care for?
When the main six joined Captain Hook here, his crew.
The Sea Ponies one.
The Sea Ponies aside, I didn't really get into that story at all, though I did find Rainbow Dash's antics in it to be somewhat amusing.
Yeah, again, that's not one that I really dislike, but I will admit I kind of left it going, It doesn't feel. That's one weird problem with the comics. They often will do these great ideas, but not always go all the way with them. Because, like, the Reflections arc I've mentioned is a very splitting series in the comics. So a lot of people love it, a lot of people hate it. I'm one of the people that likes it, but there is an argument that I do think that they didn't use the alternate universe as well as they should have. Like, maybe they should have done more with it. And that is sort of an interesting conundrum. And again, of course, you could always argue that's one reason to make a canon, because then the show could go and do those things and maybe do them either a little bit better or just expand on them more.
The thing that stood out about that arc was that the main six didn't even really meet their alternate selves, that they were just kind of referred to as wanted criminals within that universe. They didn't, if I'm remembering that correctly.
Yeah, you're right. They never met the main six never did meet their evil selves, and that didn't bother me as much because I thought it really was mostly a Celestia story when you really get down to it. But I think Celestia has been underexposed so much that I sort of went, okay, I'll take it. I mean, I really wish we'd seen the evil ones, but at least we're getting a somewhat decent Celestia story. Any other? Do you have a least favorite?
Now, for me, this is like sort of weird, but anything that features mind control, I cannot stand mind control.
Mind control? You hate any story of mind control.
Current, like, arc is currently featuring that now with the main six.
Ah.
So I figured, you know what, let's just read it and have fun with it. That's all I can do.
So you're not a fan of the pets?
That one I'll probably never read again.
Yeah. Mind control is really love it or hate it in my experience, because I was actually with a guy at another con, and he pointed out that one reason he didn't like the idea of the nightmare forces being like the nightmare moon and not really Luna was that he said it turns it more into a mind control, possession story. And he said, in possession stories, you're never interested about the person that's possessed. You're just interested in the people around him that are trying to deal with this fact that their loved one is possessed. Because, I mean, The Exorcist, if you've ever seen that movie, the girl being possessed isn't all that interesting. It's the priests that are trying to get the demon out, and, like, the mother, they're the interesting ones. So, yeah, I can certainly understand why you're not that big of a fan of mind control. Does anyone else have a least favorite? Well, I was more looking at him, but nah. Don't worry, Hasbro doesn't know who you are, so don't worry. They're not gonna find you. Do any of the tech guys in the back have a least favorite, or do you not really read the comics?
I read the comics, but I got a bundle from a Humble Bundle donated one time, and I read like some of them. I haven't gotten very far in them, but I've enjoyed all the ones I've seen so far.
Okay. You might have read all the good ones. Do you? I'm sorry, I forgot your name.
Mike, it's fine.
Oh.
I wouldn't say I have a least favorite. I mean, it's hit and miss. I still think it's a pretty good sign of quality, especially not just Hasbro, but also IDW, who, if you aren't reading some of their other comics, their Ninja Turtle series are amazing.
Oh, yeah.
So if you want to talk about another fandom that is exploding, but with the My Little Ponies comics, it really does seem to me like a more of a tongue-in-cheek like wink, wink, nod, nod to fans. We can go a little further than the show can, and that's one thing I always have appreciated. One thing that I'm kind of surprised I haven't done is actually, because you'll never really get a whole, this is how the comic fits in, or we'll never get that definite answer, but more of a pony multiverse, kind of like making it more like DC.
Oh,
Whereas
yeah.
all ponies exist in various states of time, and that's how they explain it. I'm actually surprised that they didn't go for the quick and easy, like, it's its own thing, it's fine.
Sort of a Crisis on Infinite Earth sort of thing.
Yeah, and I kind of want a picture of, like, Piggy Pie cradling Twilight Sparkle right now.
Okay. But yeah, that's an interesting point. And I like that you brought up the tongue-in-cheek thing, because while you seem to like that aspect, I know plenty of people who don't like that aspect, because a lot of people take that as sort of more of a pandering route, like you're saying, oh, look, we're referencing things we may not be able to before, we're acknowledging you. Love us.
It's very true, but if you also take that aspect from the writers, if you are reading My Little Pony, Friendship is Magic, they know for a fact you are watching the show. And you also know a lot of the inner workings of the fandom and some inside jokes. So
Yeah.
if you see Sailor Neptune and Uranus in the background, you're going to go, oh, that's cool, and then flip the page.
Yeah. It doesn't bother me as much, but I do know people who it does kind of pester.
Oh,
But
no, it does detect from not better storytelling, but more deep storytelling.
Yeah.
One of the main criticisms I have of the comic is that where it will go sometimes with really cool new aspects, it does seem shallow. That's just my take.
Oh, it was an interesting sense. Okay, it looks like we got about 5 more minutes left. So, does anyone have any last minute comments they want to make? You?
Yeah, one thing I noticed in the comics in terms of darkness is if you ever noticed observe some of the scenes or faces that some of the characters make.
Mm-hmm.
In my opinion, though, especially some of those comic book covers, that could probably give if a little girl that the target audience were to look at that could probably give them nightmares.
Oh, it might, but
Especially did you read the Jury issue, the one with the Jury clouds?
uh,
And Pony's grouchy.
oh, is that the one with is that the Rainbow Dash's Bad Day? That's actually one of the few I haven't got to, but
Some of the faces that you're on her
oh.
comics, man.
Yeah, but I've kind of always been one of those guys that follows the Don Bluth philosophy of things kids can take more than you think they can. I mean, I was exposed to a lot of things as a kid, probably that my father probably wasn't. I was trying to think. I think what was it I watched? I don't know. There was some R-rated movie I watched when I was 10, and well, whatever it was, I'm sure it didn't warp me too much. But anyway, any last-minute other comments while we're at it? No. Okay, one more.
Yeah, well, also, I think when I look at it from the writer's perspective, they're probably write for other shows too, and you can't really expect them to remember every single aspect of all previous episodes, or if they have new writers in, for those writers to have to take the time to watch all of the older episodes all the way through. If they write for other stories or do for other shows too.
Yeah,
Expect them to remember everything that happened.
yeah, but you got to be dedicated to be in this kind of job, and I mean, you don't go into Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles or Ghostbusters without knowing what those are. So, well, I don't really have anything else much to add. Does anyone else?
Go back on your point about tongue-in-cheek versus seriousness and all that. One art that usually gets brought up is the Nine of Lit Apples art,
Mm-hmm.
which I've seen an opinion really sharply divided on that as well.
Oh, yeah.
You have the side that recognizes the sort of the celebration of the B-movie sci-fi type of deal.
Mm-hmm.
But I've seen arguments on the other side saying that it does not fit into the style or the continuity of the show just because of the general idea that the presenter presents.
Again, sort of a difference it's a difference in style, but frankly, MLP has always sort of been this weird sort of androgynous, I guess, universe, because like we see machines from like the 18th century, you know, the Flim and Flam wheel, machines like that. Advanced machinery while also going on with like these primitive houses living like that. It's sort of this conflation of things, so frankly it doesn't bother me as much as others, but yeah, I can understand why it's divided about that, so yeah. Well, I think it's almost about time, so we're gonna wrap this up. Thank you very much for coming. You could have been a sleeper at the Ponies the Anthology panel, but you spent it here with me, and I'm very happy for that. Thank you, and have a great rest of the con.